So how much do you know about the role that North Carolinians played in the development of the U.S. Constitution? Welcome to Locker Room Talk. I'm Donna Martinez. I'm joined by the expert who can share some fascinating details with us. Dr. Troy Kickler is the founding director of the North Carolina History Project. That is a special project of the John Locke Foundation. So, Troy, I was really fascinated when you and I were chatting about this, and you told me that there is a North Carolina signer who was also writing about climate change at the time of the founding?
Right. Many people are surprised about that because that is a hot topic in today's political scene. But people have been writing about climate change for 500 years. And Hugh Williamson is the founding father that you're talking about. He was from Edenton, North Carolina. And he was a Renaissance man. He was also a medical doctor. He would write about politics. And he wrote about climate change. In 1770, he penned an article that he read in front of the American Philosophical Society, and it was later published, as I mentioned, as an essay. And he wondered, apparently, he was commenting on the fact that in the American colonies for 30, 40 years prior to this, the publication of this article, he said many colonists have been saying that the winters aren't as cold as they used to be and the summers aren't as hot as it used to be. So it was like it was just milder all year long. And so he was wondering what was causing that.
It kind of makes you think that there are no new issues since we're talking about climate change
That's right.
today.
Yes, and
pretty interesting.
People were talking about it. In certain circles, people were talking about it in 1770.
So tell us how many North Carolinians were involved with the Constitution, how many signed, and how many were involved in the whole debate?
Okay, the legislature appointed 5 delegates to the Constitutional Convention. Only 3 signed the document. And the other 2, Alexander Martin and William Davie, didn't sign it because they had any objection to the Constitution. They just weren't there when it was signed. They had left early. And there were 3 signers of the U.S. Constitution: Richard Dobbs Speight, Sr., Hugh Williamson, the man we mentioned
Mr. Climate Change
before, right, and William Blount. Those were the 3 who signed the Constitution. Hugh Williamson spoke approximately 70 times. Richard Dobbs Speight attended every session. He was one of the younger delegates, but he, if you look at the records, he obviously didn't say much. And William Blount was absent for a lot of the time, and he really didn't play, be honest, he really didn't have a significant role in the debate, but he did sign the Constitution. So Blount, Williamson, and Speight were the 3 delegates from North Carolina who signed the document.
Troy, when they signed such a momentous document, did it make them a celebrity?
Well, these men were already, I don't know if celebrity is the right word, but they were already significant and influential in their communities. They were already well known. So I wouldn't say it made them into a celebrity, but they were already prominent figures in their communities to begin with.
After they signed and they came back to live and work, did they go around talking about what the principles were of the Constitution, or did they sign it and then just go back to being, whatever they were, lawyers, dentists, whatever?
Right. Well, they continued in their professions, of course, but they talked about the Constitution, and Hugh Williamson in particular wrote about the Constitution. He penned essays because you must remember that there were some people who didn't think that a new Constitution was necessary, or they thought that it needed a Bill of Rights, or they wondered what certain clauses meant, like the necessary and proper clause. And so there were some proponents of the Constitution, like Hugh Williamson, who were writing essays to try to convince North Carolinians to ratify the Constitution. So yes, they were talking about it, they were writing about it, they were campaigning for the adoption of the U.S. Constitution.
How did they let people know? I mean, they were writing things, but of course there wasn't at that time the type of media that we just take for granted today. So in that era, how would they spread the message?
Well, these essays were printed in newspapers up and down the Atlantic coast and in North Carolina as well, major newspapers in New Bern, Wilmington, the Edenton area. And there were people who would read these essays, prominent people, but then a lot of times speeches were given on courthouse lawns. Political speeches were, well, you could still say they're a form of entertainment today, but it was something to do. during the time. So some people would gather, whether, if they couldn't read or write, let's say they couldn't read the article in the paper, they would hear about it at the market or at the pub, or they would hear about it literally from the politician's mouth on the courthouse lawn, listening to a speech.
It's interesting as well that you have written about some of the things that happened to later on in life to these people who signed the Constitution. One of them ended up in a duel.
Yes, Richard Dobbs Speight ended up in a duel. Around late 1790s, political parties started to form in the United States. There had always been political factions, but parties as we know it started to form. And Richard Dobbs Speight was acquiring more Jeffersonian tendencies, so he switched political parties in the late 1700s. And John Stanley of New Bern, both of these men were from New Bern, John Stanley criticized Speight, questioning whether his switching political parties was a sincere move or whether he was just doing it for political purposes. Well, he not only criticized him, he did so in print, in the public sphere. And so they would write letters in the paper, and this went on for a while. And eventually they were in a duel, and Richard Dobbs Speight got the worst end of it. And what's interesting...
You mean he died?
He died the next day.
My word.
And dueling was outlawed in North Carolina. That was the last that I know of. That was the last legal duel in North Carolina. But what's interesting about this duel is sometimes men would have... feel like they've been dishonored. They wanted satisfaction. So they would go to a duel, and a round would be fired, and they missed, and then cooler heads would prevail. They're okay, we fired a shot.
Maybe I won't kill you.
We both showed up, shake hands and go their separate ways. But these guys fired 4 times. And on the 4th round, Speight was hit in the side, I believe, and then the next day he died. So you think about how long it takes to load a gun back then. I mean,
so they thought about this.
They were
very committed to this.
5 to 10 minutes they had to be thinking about. Yes, so yeah.
And we think that politics today is hardball. At least we don't have a duel, right?
That's right. That's right.
Now, there was another person who ended up being thrown in prison for having debt. Tell us about that.
He was a founding father, James Wilson, who was originally from Pennsylvania. He was a law professor up there. Some people say he is the mind behind the Constitution. He's one of the 6 founders who signed the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. But when he was on the U.S. Supreme Court, he was on the first bench of the United States Supreme Court. He was in prison for debt. He was a land speculator. He made bad investments. He couldn't pay his debt, which was quite significant debt, so he was put in prison for a while. And then he moves to North Carolina the last year and a half of his life. He was friends with James Iredell, another justice of the U.S. Supreme Court who happened to be from North Carolina. And when he died, Iredell helped settle his estate.
Now, another one wasn't thrown into prison, but it was actually thrown out of something, and that would have been the United States Senate?
That's right. He was expelled from the U.S. Senate, and there were people who wanted to put him in prison.
Really? Who was this?
William Blount. He was from Bertie County, North Carolina, and he was one of the North Carolina delegates that we mentioned who signed the Constitution. Well, later he becomes a U.S. Senator from Tennessee. Tennessee, at the time of the signing of the Constitution, what we know as modern-day Tennessee, was part of North Carolina. 1796, I believe, Tennessee becomes its own state. And William Blount is one of its first senators, and he was very influential in the drafting of the first state constitution there. Well, he was a land speculator, and he owned a lot of land out west, but the price of land didn't increase the way he thought it would. So he plotted... He had a plot which caused him to be expelled from the U.S. Senate. And what that plot was he was trying to encourage the Cherokee and the Creek to work with the British to capture New Orleans from the Spanish, because he thought that would increase the value of land out west, and then he could sell it. And then when this was found out, he was expelled. There were people who wanted to bring criminal charges against him, but make a long, complicated story short, he never went to prison.
Troy, there's just some great stories that you've been sharing with us about the North Carolinians who were involved in signing the Constitution. Each year in September, the nation commemorates Constitution Day. We hear a lot of people talking about the Constitution. Is it a living, breathing document, or should it be read with the original intent? What role do you think that the Constitution should play in our lives each day?
Well, I think it's good that on the September 17th anniversary of the submission of the Constitution to the people of the states to ratify is a good idea. It's actually Constitution and Citizenship Day. It's good to be reminded of the U.S. Constitution, supreme law of the land, because it reminds us that there is a rule of law and not the rule of men, the rule of people. Leaders today need to consult that Constitution, so they just can't do what they want willy-nilly. And if you don't like what is in the U.S. Constitution, then you can suggest an amendment to that Constitution. So I don't think the Constitution is a living, breathing document where it can just change with the sentiment of the times. However, I don't think it's etched in stone where it cannot be changed. One just has to go about the proper process to amending the Constitution or interpreting the Constitution.
Troy, it's been great fun talking with you about this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I always enjoy talking about it.
We've been talking with Dr. Troy Kickler. He is the founding director of the North Carolina History Project. That's a special project of the John Locke Foundation. You can read all about all of these fascinating stories and lots more about the U.S. and the North Carolina Constitution at northcarolinahistory.org. I'm Donna Martinez. Thanks for joining us on Locker Room Talk.